This is what happens when you send armed agents of the state to deal with all kinds of problems. The police are the police because they use violence. They are not trained to handle all the things that they're being asked to deal with. If you don't listen to what we're telling you here in the academy, this could be you. The rhetoric of a war on cops doesn't match up with the empirical reality. If you took away the guns and the batons and the pepper spray and everything else, they might still wear a badge and have a uniform. They'd still work for the state, but they wouldn't be the police anymore.
I'm here with Michael Sierra-Arevalo, assistant professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin and author of The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing that was published 2 days ago, if I'm correct, which congratulations on that. Now, before we get into some of the themes covered in the book, could you give us a quick rundown of your background and experience that led to you writing a book on policing?
Sure. And thanks for having me today, Brandon. I'm happy to be here. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at UT, and I began this project, almost 10 years ago, after the police killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. And so I originally went to graduate school to do work on gangs and got involved with some violence reduction work. And it was in the course of that work that I first met police officers. And I was sort of struck by how mundane they were, how normal they were. They had a very special job. They clearly had very different concerns than a lot of the people around me. They were really focused on violence and guns and things like that, but they were otherwise like pretty normal seeming people. And I think it was that sort of intersection of seemingly mundane, but such a special and important jobs with such a deep consequence that when I began to read more, like a lot of people, when Michael Brown was killed, and I began to see how little we knew empirically about the police, I thought that, you know what, this is where I want to spend my time. I want to better understand the how and why of policing and specifically police violence. And that's when I started getting into a car to ride around with police officers.
So then break down for us what the danger imperative is and just how prominent do you see it being in law enforcement?
So the danger imperative, the title of the book, it refers to what sociologists call a cultural frame. But in simpler terms, it just means a lens, a sort of filter. And we all have cultural frames that we employ in different parts of our lives. If you're a student, you probably have a particular frame that you use when you're in the context of school. You have a frame for your particular job. You have a frame that you might employ as a family member. Police also have a frame, but this is a frame that is maintained within the institution of policing specifically, a filter, a way of seeing the world. You could think of them as sort of violence-tinted glasses. And that's the key point about the danger imperative. The danger imperative is centered on the preoccupation with violence and the sanctity of providing for officer safety at all times. And that frame is not something that officers just sort of download from the academy and then go out into the world with this sort of software running. Instead, while it might begin in the academy formally, it is something that is perpetuated daily within the context of the police department. It is in their lineup rooms before they go out on shift, and then it manifests in their tattoos. It manifests in the commemorations of dead officers that are all around them. It manifests in how they stand and how they talk with each other and how they interact with the public. It's not just an academy thing. It's an all day, every day kind of phenomenon.
And a lot of what you hear when it comes to this rhetoric and talking about policing, and especially so in America, is kind of like there's a war on cops. Like it's so dangerous to be a cop, especially now so more than ever, and just how dangerous that job is. Can you explain how maybe through your research and studies, how if the data matches up with that, or if it's actually getting safer or where officers are in terms of danger level?
Sure. So every now and again, you'll see one of these op-eds that comes out and it says things like, oh, policing's not even in the top 10 most dangerous jobs. And that is true if you define danger very specifically. And they usually are defining it in terms of fatalities, in terms of deaths, the rate of deaths very specifically. And that is very true. Truck drivers and construction workers and other less overtly what you might consider dangerous jobs are actually, by the numbers, far more likely to result in a death than policing. But that sort of misses the much wider range of things that are dangerous. And when you expand our definition to something like assaults and more specifically deaths and injury resulting from violence, policing is more dangerous than being a truck driver or being a construction worker or being a professor. That much is true. It is more dangerous than those jobs. But the claim of a war on cops, this suggests rhetorically that we must be drowning in officers shot and officers dying in the line of duty. There must be some seismic shift in how often these sorts of attacks are happening. And the data simply doesn't support that contention. There is obviously variation over time in how these things happen. And we have seen some short term increases, specifically in the years during COVID, when we actually saw increases in violence sort of across the board. So it's not really all that surprising that violence against police also increased, though certainly not to the degree that we saw violence spike in the general public. We recently published a paper in Criminology sort of documenting this short-term spike specifically after the murder of George Floyd. But the rhetoric of a war on cops doesn't match up with the empirical reality of a phenomenon, namely shootings of police officers, that remain statistically very rare.
And having a bit of firsthand knowledge or insight yourself, does this rhetoric kind of cause like a culture of fear that you see in the departments? And then how does this manifest in the way they carry out their operations?
I think the word cause is very strong. So I don't think it's one to one. I will say that this rhetoric serves as a building block in a much broader structure of how officers think about their work. And so nobody, while I was on patrol, sort of was like, hey, by the way, have you read that book, The War on Cops by Heather McDonald? Like that wasn't like a one-to-one. They read the book and now they believe that this is the case and now it's the culture. Instead, police, like the rest of us, are embedded in a broader social context in which there's media, in which they also can watch the news and they also consume things on their Facebooks and on their Instagram feeds. And it turns out that police officers' social media feeds are not the same as most people's. They consume things like Police One, which is a very popular policing website. They consume policing-focused social media, which, as you might imagine, tends to amplify these rare but catastrophic incidents where officers are stabbed and shot and all these other things. And so the rhetoric is not something that necessarily causes the culture per se. But I will say that policing is very able and willing to regurgitate that rhetoric, to take that rhetoric and incorporate it into something that is a very deeply held assumption and belief within policing, which is that their job is profoundly dangerous. And as a result, they must take steps to ensure their survival at all times.
And then, so I guess they're not just the rhetoric, but all this that they could be taking in, like you said, different things they're seeing on their social medias. Does this kind of change the way you see how they're handling like day-to-day situations or the different, maybe like arrests or simple like traffic stops and things like that?
I think that it is something that permeates all of what officers do. And so in the context of their interactions with the public, a lot of what they're doing that is shaped by the danger imperative, this lens that they're seeing the world through, a lot of it is stuff that you might not notice unless you know what you're looking for. So, for example, the way that officers stand is something that's taught in academies, and it's taught by their FTOs, field training officers, when they're brand new officers sort of on patrol. And they're taught, for example, to stand with their gun side, the side of their hip where their gun is, tilted away from people that they're talking to. And the logic is relatively simple. You want to keep that further away from somebody's reach so they have a harder time grabbing it, so they don't disarm you. They're taught to do things like write notes with their notepad up by their chest instead of staring straight down. Why? Two reasons. One, they should be able to look and see who they're talking to in case someone chooses to potentially attack them or run or grab a gun. And if their hands are up by their chest, they also have a better ability to, say, block if someone tries to strike them or push somebody away. These are small things that really, those things are not likely to get anybody hurt in and of themselves, but they do speak to a mindset. They speak to an assumption that officers have, which is that there's really no such thing as somebody who is inherently safe for me as a police officer to speak to. And I think what I saw most often was something that is called command presence, And I saw command presence, which broadly speaking is sort of um, it's sort of how officers carry themselves to show people that they are in charge and to show them that they are to be respected and that they have authority. And that in and of itself isn't the issue. And I saw some officers wield command presence to great effect, and they were able to kind of modulate their behavior in a really appropriate way. The problem is that sometimes command presence that just turns into naked, needless aggression. And that takes these interactions into a direction that, ironically enough, is more likely to result in aggression and violence. And that's one of the unintended consequences of the danger imperative.
And another point kind of to that I wanted to touch on and ask you about is, despite there being some clear racial animus present in numerous ways in law enforcement, the practices that kind of perpetuate the social inequalities don't really rely on individuals or individual acts, but they're structurally built in. And I saw that you speak on how the danger imperative kind of provides the framework for officers to justify these actions or beliefs in the name of safety. Is this something that you could go a little deeper on, explaining specifically how safety is prioritized over everything else?
Sure. So and I'm really glad that you bring that up because it's core to the argument. And the reason I emphasize the importance of structure really is twofold. One, I want to move our understanding of police violence away from one which relies on these bad apples logics that, oh, it was an individual mistake, this is just a bad officer or a poorly trained officer. I say that that's not the case, that actually what we're seeing out in the world is the system working as intended. That these quote unquote errors are actually something that is baked into the system. These things are bound to happen. It doesn't make a lot of sense to think about them as malfunctions. And the second is the race blind nature of the danger imperative. It's not to say that race doesn't matter and that police racism or racism more broadly, probably more importantly, doesn't exist. It's instead that the way that the danger imperative is recreated in officers' training, in the memorial walls, in how they talk about it, has a very conspicuous lack of any mention of race. When you're in the academy, the discussion is always about this amorphous threat. It is about weapons, and weapons don't have a race. It's always about taking these steps that you can seemingly divorce from any consideration about who you're interacting with, their race or even gender. And it's all about just responding to these quote unquote threats. Now, of course, we know that words like criminal and threat, or even something like gang member, which is talked about in many departments as an especially prescient threat, these things are coded. They are racially coded. And so you actually can recreate the assumptions of the danger imperative without explicitly talking about race. If you were to explicitly talk about race and were to explicitly say things like, you got to be really careful around young Black men, or you got to be really careful around Latino guys with a certain haircut, well, that would be like too overt, and that would be like highly problematic to talk about things in that way. Instead, you have this veneer of race blind, almost scientific discussions about the nature of threat. And that's core to what makes this so palatable and so easy to justify within the broader institution of policing.
Yeah. And so looking at some of the chapters in your book where you speak on some of these things and the danger imperative as a whole, I wanted to maybe get a brief summary of some of the real world applications of how these problems present themselves. The first one being the survival school, which touches on the police academy. How does this type of training stand to exacerbate these issues that we see and that you discuss in the danger imperative?
So I'll point to two things. One is that this is something that's been happening for a long time, the kind of training that I point to in the academy. So one example, it's the most famous video that non-police have never heard of. And it's the murder of Deputy Kyle Dinkheller. He was a sheriff's deputy in rural Georgia. And he died, I think at this point now, over 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And Deputy Dinkheller was murdered on the side of the road by someone that he pulled over. It was a Vietnam vet that was off his meds. And the video is shown for a couple of reasons. One, it's shown to officers to emphasize to them that there are costs if you don't act decisively, And that's often a lesson taught to officers, young officers who are often only 20 years old when they're in the academy, that if you don't take decisive action and use violence when you need to, you could be like Kyle Deputy Dinkheller. I think even more fundamentally, these kinds of videos they're horrifying. I don't show the video to audiences specifically because of how gruesome it is. And it's not even because you can see Deputy Dinkheller being murdered. It's because you can hear it. You can hear his terrified screams. You can hear him in his last moments. One officer that I talked to explicitly remembered you can hear the sound of gurgling blood. This is intentionally shown to new recruits to emphasize for them what the stakes of their new job is. This is shown to them often within the first couple of days of the academy. So it's kind of like it's a wake-up call. It's very intentionally designed to tell them, this is for real. And if you don't listen to what we're telling you here in the academy, this could be you, right? Like this is what you're signing up for, even if the likelihood of that happening is incredibly low. And more of what policing is essentially armed social work. Now, the second piece of the puzzle that I point to, which I think is most problematic, is when you incorporate what you can more broadly think of as warrior style training or violence glorifying training, like that which is pushed by people like Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. A bunch of articles have been written about Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, who is the self-professed founder of the discipline of killology. He wrote a book called On Combat, another book called On Killing. And in one department that I was in, their official training documents cite this particular author. And they cite things like, quote, "You must become the predator to catch the predator." This kind of training just has no place in modern police departments and contemporary policing. But the problem is that there's very little oversight, really, in terms of what gets taught in these police academies. A lot of training is essentially rubber stamped, and training officers have a lot of leeway to teach kind of whatever they want, as long as they essentially hit the bare minimums for their state mandated training. These are just two examples. There's a lot more in that particular chapter.
Yeah, I'm sure that the examples are plentiful. You could probably go on listing them, especially with something that has been around for so long and hasn't really been changed or to fit with the times and how things are evolving. Another chapter in the book is Doing Danger, where I believe you speak on how police take these actions and the behaviors that they may learn or teach themselves for safety purposes, which kind of only further reinforces the danger imperative. Could you explain how some of these behaviors could directly endanger the safety of the public?
Sure. Yeah, chapter 4. I think the new title is Going Home at Night. But so I already talked a little bit about command presence. So that is one where officers are taught that they have to maintain control at all times. And it turns out that sometimes maintaining control or the urge to do that through sometimes very aggressive means can actually lead things to spiral out of control, as opposed to, say, de-escalating or simply like building time and space or just like retreating a little bit. That's actually antithetical to how many police are taught, this idea of like taking a step back. Instead, they're taught to go hands on. They're taught to insert themselves physically and violently if necessary. This is something that I saw happen multiple times, even in the context of calls where people were calling for help. So one case was a call that originally came in, this was on the East Coast, as an attempted arson. It turns out, and this is very common, the call says one thing, but then you get there and it's something completely different. And so we arrive on scene, and it turns out the call was actually driven by the fact that the quote unquote suspect, it was actually a young man who was off of his meds, had been diagnosed with schizophrenia at one point, and he had put like a red towel or something over a lamp to make it dimmer, and the lamp began to smoke. So who knows what the 911 call taker was told, but that somehow got coded as an attempted arson, which is like a violent crime and is very serious. And really, this was a whole lot of nothing. In the course of talking to this young man, the officer that was there said something to the effect of, "Oh, okay, so like, who was punching walls?" And the young man says, like, what? Like, I wasn't punching any walls. Like, that's bullshit. And then he says, "Oh, so are you calling your sister a liar?" And that was I don't know why he decided to go in that direction. But the guy says, essentially the kid says, well, you know, like, I don't want to, like, I'm out of here. I'm done with this, and tries to leave. The officer says, hey, I didn't say you could go, tries to block his way. The kid tries to push past him, and now the fight is on. It quickly spirals. The other officer there jumps on top as well. They dogpile him. They OC spray him. They take him outside. There is no real reason why any of this needed to happen, but all of this was because the officer was trying to maintain control. The logic being, you can't just like walk away. I don't know if you're going to go grab a weapon. And all of this is trained. This all happened actually according to training. Again, remember what I said, like, this is not a malfunction. This is what's designed to happen. Mm-hmm. Or a case that I saw on the West Coast where somebody calls in, they had suicidal ideation, that they needed help. The officers show up, and it's a homeless man. He's drunk, and the officer's trying to talk to him, and he like goes to reach into his trash bag. The officer's like, hey, don't reach for that. And the guy's like, he's hammered, and he just kind of keeps rummaging around in his bag. Next thing you know, the guy gets grabbed. He gets pinned to the park bench. The other officer runs in. The guy's like, wow, what are you doing? And naturally, like, he's really pissed off at this point because he called the cops. He called 911 for help. The cops show up. Now he's getting manhandled. Fast forward, he ends up getting transported to the hospital. There's no weapons in the bag. But again, this is not accidental. This is what happens when you send armed agents of the state to deal with all kinds of problems with the training and the socialization and the culture, which they are intentionally given and which they intentionally recreate.
Yeah, and when it kind of comes to the solutions of the dangers we see from this, because as you kind of spoke to at the beginning, the reality versus expectations of officers are usually vastly different, where most people think they're constantly in police chases or dangerous shootouts. They're really rather mundane, people. They're not doing much extravagant things. Most of the times they're on their jobs. What are your thoughts on something like splitting up these sorts of jobs to different kinds of people who may or may not have firearms, depending on what the call is, like social workers, mental health professionals? Or what do you think maybe a good solution would be to these kinds of dangers?
Sure. I think that we're currently wrestling with less of the, is that a good idea? I think that there is increasing agreement that cops do too much. And officers themselves will be the first ones to tell you, I get sent to do so many things that have nothing to do with policing. And we can disagree about what that means, policing. Often what they're talking about is, this is not serious crime. There is no need to arrest anybody here, and nobody is being actively hurt. So why am I here? Why am I being called for this? I think that we're coming to a place where we increasingly recognize that there is something to that we're actually asking officers to do a lot, and they are not trained to handle all the things that they're being asked to deal with. And in fact, they have a very limited set of tools with which to handle all of these complex problems. I think what we're wrestling with is the how. How do we go about disaggregating these things in a way that doesn't blow up in our faces? Because we have this unfortunate status quo where we have more guns than people in this country. And that's an inescapable fact about policing and public safety in the United States, is the ubiquity of firearms. So, one of these unfortunate realities is, if you send enough unarmed social workers to enough calls that police were often going to themselves, eventually you're going to get some unarmed social workers that get hurt. That is going to happen. I'm not really in the business of saying, like, what is the right number of social workers versus innocent civilians that are, say, shot or grabbed or punched by the police. But there is an equilibrium. Currently, we have decided that the best setup is to have armed officers go with guns and vast legal protections to use violence. And so the cost of things going awry is essentially borne by the police and the people that are calling for help. And it's the police that are given the legal protections to use violence and to protect themselves, far more so than the public themselves. I think that the direction that I would like for us to move is one in which we just take some low-hanging fruit. We currently treat officer safety and public safety as if they're separate things. I think that we could actually begin to think about interventions that can provide for both of those things simultaneously. I think that reducing violence writ large is good for cops too, because it turns out that you can make streets safer that cops are on as well. And so we can do very simple things like improve lighting. That's been shown to reduce violence. We can green lots and fix the facades of buildings. That's been shown to reduce violence. We even have evidence to suggest that if you plant trees and reduce the ambient temperature you can reduce violence because crime and violence are correlated with temperature. A recent study even showed that if you increase the number of behavioral health treatment centers, you can specifically reduce the number of assaults on police officers. Currently, police are very often left as the only ones responsible for providing for officer safety. And I don't think they have to do it alone. I think that officers should be the first ones advocating for non-police interventions to reduce crime and violence. That's not the case currently, but I think that we can and should move in that direction.
Yeah, and I wanted to end with this question, and you already kind of touched on the first part of it. So maybe, any parts that you didn't mention, you could touch on, but more so to the second half of it. How do we get to a point where we see a noticeable change? And then what would you say to the people who are kind of impatient of wanting to see it right now?
Advocating for that change and moving towards that change begins with a reframing of what we think the police are. I have grown increasingly frustrated with conversations around how we change police training. Don't get me wrong. I think that even in the book, I say that we should not do warrior style killology training, like stop funding that, stop paying for that. But do I think that's going to fundamentally change the patterns that I describe in the danger imperative? No. But I think that we should do that. As a normative claim, I think that it's bad to have that in police training and we shouldn't do it. But I think that we also spend all this time talking about procedural justice training and legitimacy training and cultural sensitivity training and this training when, I don't really care how you cut it. Policing is violent. That's the whole point of the police. The police are empowered and trained to use violence. And we've increasingly told them to do other things, but we can't really act surprised that when the institution that revolves around the use of violence that's sanctioned by the state uses violence, again, that's the system working as intended. The police are doing what they were trained and expected, and in fact are rewarded for doing. That's the point. If you took away the guns and the batons and the pepper spray and everything else, they might still wear a badge and have a uniform. They'd still work for the state, but they wouldn't be the police anymore. The police are the police because they use violence. And so I think that's a different place to have our conversation is, well, they are violent. And so what are our next steps? And for those that are frustrated with the pace of change, who want to see change happen more quickly, I think that you should take heart in that changes that are going to happen locally. Waiting for federal legislation, whether that be gun legislation or calling for things like more behavioral health treatment centers, that's not something that's going to happen federally, or at least I don't think that you should be holding your breath for these big federal changes. I think change is local. I think change is at your state level. And I think that we are increasingly becoming dissatisfied with the way that conversations are happening. I do believe, though, that sometimes we have to plant the seeds of trees under whose shade we will not ourselves sit. The changes that we're planting now may not manifest on a timeline that we're happy with, but you have to keep the pressure on and you have to keep it on for as long as you can.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to sum it up. So if there was any last things that you wanted to touch on, and then also you can let people know where to find the book, and if you have any events or anything you want to shout out, the floor is yours.
Awesome. I appreciate that. So my new book is called The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing. It dives into the how and why of police violence. It's not a story of bad apples. It's a story of systems. If you want to understand how so many of these incidents seem so crazy and how you can't seem to understand them, I think this book helps you understand why they're the logical outcome of a system of policing that we've built. You can find the book on Amazon or a bookstore near you. And for anybody that does get the book, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. You can shoot me a message at www.dangerimperative.com.
Awesome. And thank you again for taking your time to speak with me. Wonderful conversation. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I appreciate you.
Awesome. See ya.